I'm here to talk about my part in this panel discussion here and talk. So Matt was talking to us about why we should bother with global citizenship education. And Harry was talking about how to inspire others to actually take up the mantle, as it were. And I'm here to talk about how. How can we put some of those things into practice, though, although we've just seen plenty of examples from Harry just now. And I'm going to talk to you about a time in my life when I was living in the Himalaya region of Nepal. And because of that, it's brought in and allowed me to bring in diversity, equity, and inclusion, as well as sustainable practices, and as well as furthering global citizenship education. So that's my bit today. And what I was doing in Nepal was teacher training. Now, interestingly, Matt was talking about, that being the spark that sets the ripples going, and you have one effect on maybe a handful of students, but they have an effect on more and more people. Well, that's when I went from teaching to teacher education, because I realized that I could actually have a greater reach and maybe influence what teachers do in their classrooms, and therefore have a bigger ripple effect. And I got going on teacher education in 2000. And from 2000 to 2003, I lived in a remote part of Nepal, tucked up in the Himalayan region. And this is what the classrooms looked like. The woman in the picture there was my counterpart, Chinu Sigdel. And she was the single only female teacher in that school. It was the highest level school in the area, in the valley. And so it was very important to have teacher training going on there, because that's where students were coming to from the primary schools in the area. And the two boys you can see in the foreground are really creative boys who saw vehicles for the first time, because in this region there was no electricity, no running water, and there were no roads. So you didn't see vehicles very often. But these two boys had seen vehicles, and they replicated them, and they made a model bulldozer, which they saw digging out a kind of rough road, and a little four-wheel drive car. And that's what you can see in front of them. They made them out of cardboard, out of little stones, out of canes, bamboo cane, and pieces of straw. And so I realized that there was a lot of curiosity and a lot of creativity in these children, regardless of the remote area that they were living in. The teachers there had nothing but a blackboard. And the blackboard that they had was all that they had. Blackboard and chalk, basically, was all that they had. And it meant, as you can see, very basic conditions. So there was a lot of chalk and talk going on. Now, English in the classroom meant there was a lot of grammar, a lot of sentence practice, a lot of sentence structure. But the students were kind of not really into it, because they only had to do English to be able to pass their school leaving certificate. It was one of 10 subjects they had to get before they could go on into further education. Now, further education wasn't the most important thing in their lives, because they would wake up early, they would have to help in the fields, because their parents grew their own rice and buckwheat, basic vegetables. And to get milk in the morning, they would have to go and collect grass or leaves, depending on the season, to go and feed the family buffalo or cow, if they were wealthy enough to actually have livestock. And that was their daily start to the day before they even got to school. So both teachers and students had quite normally done at least 2 to 3 hours of physical work in the morning before they had a big breakfast, and then gone to school. And then they would be at school all day until 3:30, 4 o'clock. And that would be when they had their next meal, when they got home. So there were these people who were there, and school was kind of secondary in their life, or so it seemed. And I arrived thinking, okay, I'm going to do my teacher training work. And I was all mad about English and improving English teaching. And suddenly I realized I was in a context where English didn't really matter, if I was going to be really honest with myself. And so as a result of that, I decided I had to do things differently. And what could I do? Well, I thought maybe, just maybe, we can look at the context of what was going on. And these young kids, especially who came to school, often had streaming eyes, streaming noses, really bad throat infections and respiratory illnesses. And one day, as we were doing the passive voice in the class, I thought, smokeless stoves. That's what we could do. Use this passive voice to describe how to make a smokeless stove. So that was basically what we decided to do next. Now, in the context of these classrooms, it was very basic: benches, mud floors. And that's me in the image there. And these are the murals that I had helped schools achieve. So I got a little bit of funding to have at least one, if not two, walls concreted and whitewashed, so that the walls themselves became resources. So the vocabulary was reflecting their surroundings. So that's a mural of a typical sort of scene if you looked out of a window in any of the classrooms where I was working. And as you can see, I'm the only female there. So many staff, school staff, consisted of males. So it was bringing in the idea of equity as well. And then, of course, there were different classes within the community. You had very educated classes, and their parents may have been teachers in the school, or maybe working in the city elsewhere in the country. And at the other end of the scale, you had people who were farming other people's land. And so sometimes for them, if children didn't go to school, they would have an extra pair of hands in the field to help them earn money. So school wasn't the most important place. So we had to make it more interesting. We had to make school itself more interesting. And the context of English had to become more interesting. So what I found was a German technical corporation called GIZ had produced smokeless stoves, and they help countries all over the world with technical development. And they developed a simple stove that allowed an enclosed fire to cook the meal and to extract the smoke via a chimney. They had a basic manual with diagrams and instructions. So I got myself a copy of that and basically studied it. And then in the school, we decided we were going to make some smokeless stoves. Now for that, we needed raw material. And the children at the school brought the material themselves. So we needed mud, we needed straw, we needed manure, and we needed water. And here we were doing proportions and maths with the group. So you had how much soil did you need? How much straw did you need? How much manure did you need? How much water did you have to add? And from proportions, we could go to ratios. All of this was done in English, by the way. So it became a cross-curricular activity. And once the children had brought in the materials, then we had to give them the instructions. So they wrote, looking at the diagram, they wrote instructions of how to make a smokeless stove. Now, because we had the word smokeless, in English, we could talk about the suffix of less. So we had aimless, hopeless, loveless. We had all kinds of language coming in from that. And then we had the language of the imperative, the use of the verb to give instructions. And with that also came the passive voice. So in the next class up, in 7th grade, they were doing passive voice. So we changed the sentences that grade 6 had produced with the passive voice. And 7th grade had to convert those sentences into the passive voice. And they could see that it went along with the description and image of a smokeless stove. And then the higher grade were then going to work with that, and they were going to actually produce the mixture and form the actual form of the chimney. Now, in the foreground, in the bottom right-hand corner of that image, you can see some sections of bamboo. And that bamboo was used once the mixture was made to put it around the bamboo, and sections of it was then left in the sun to dry. And then we would have the building blocks for the chimney that would eventually take away the smoke. Now, for this to actually happen, you had to sift the soil to remove all the stones. You had to chop the grass or the hay. You had to mix the materials together. You had to add the water, and you had to knead. And that's what the boys on the right-hand side are doing. They had to knead the mixture. So you've got all of these verbs playing part in it. So they learnt a whole host of new language as well. And what I found really nice, what happened was the interest that all the other kids, even if they weren't involved in either grade 5, 6, 7, or 8, they wanted to be part of it. It was like, what's this about? And so there was curiosity. It was like, what are they doing? What's it for? What's this smokeless stove? And this boy who's getting his hands and feet dirty was mixing it. Now, he was not the most academic of boys. He wasn't really into studying, but he wanted to do this, and he was really interested in, because it was a bit different. He was able to move, to do things that he couldn't do sat behind a bench in a typical classroom. So it allowed students who learnt in different ways, who had differing needs, who had divergent neurons in terms of the way they learnt, it allowed them into the learning process as well. And not only that, but parents became involved. They became curious. It's like, what are you asking our children to bring in soil for? So we had visits from parents, just curious, wanting to know what was going on. And that parental involvement brought about a whole different level of interest, we found. And then in the grade 9 students, what was going on there was health studies. So they looked at data and figures of how smoke affected health in their communities and in the country of Nepal, because there were figures we took from UNICEF documents. And they also looked at the inefficiency of cooking on an open wood fire. They looked at how much wood you needed to cook a meal, and how long it took on an open fire and then on a smokeless stove. So they did a compare and contrast study of cooking exactly the same food on 2 different kinds of stoves, and they recorded the results. So they could see for themselves the difference. Now, why was this important? Because English in their environment was like, yeah, so what? And various mothers came up to me and said, you know, this English business that you do, it's all very good. And yes, our children do need it to get through the exam at the end of the academic secondary school. But the thing that you're doing with these smokeless stoves, that's really something else, is what they said. And I kept hearing it. And I said to them, why? I said, because the children are coming home and explaining to us parents why we shouldn't have an open stove, what smoke is doing to us. They're telling us that we need to get a smokeless stove, and they're showing us how we can make it. So it wasn't just a kind of change going on in terms of their English learning and their maths and cross-curricular activities. There was an actual change going on in the community. And also the actual making of the stove itself. You needed proportions, you needed to measure the hole of the stove had to be exactly right. The height of the stove, so the rocks that you can see in this picture had to be a particular height so that there was enough room for oxygen to enter and for the fire to burn most efficiently. In this part of the world, deforestation was a major problem. It was left to mostly females to go and chop the wood and carry the wood back. There was so much deforestation in the area where I lived that the people of the community had to walk 2 hours to go to someone else's community forest, chop down the wood, pay them to be able to do that, and then carry it back. So the longer that wood lasted, the better. So it was a win-win situation. And that was what the chimney looked like. It had to be a certain height. So physics came into this as well, because for a fire to burn efficiently, you need a certain amount of oxygen. You need a certain height of chimney to draw the air through and pull the smoke away so it doesn't come out of the front either. And this stove became the prototype. Parents would come by. The teachers at the school would occasionally cook together to celebrate an occasion, or if there was a special reason, we would eat communally and the food would be cooked on this fire. And when smoke was billowing out of the chimney at the back, people would come by and say, where's the smoke coming from? How come there's no smoke in the room? How is it done? So there was interest, there was curiosity in what we were doing. Now, this is a very particular example of a time that I spent in this type of community. Now, I'm not suggesting we can all have that kind of activity going on in our classrooms. Smokeless stoves may not apply to your kind of context, but we need to find a context that fits, is what I'm trying to say with this example. And maybe in your school, you could do something like papier-mâché, yeah? So, for example, the papier-mâché is when you break up bits of paper and you add glue to it, and then it becomes this kind of thing that you can shape and mold, very similar to this kind of clay molding chimney that you can see here. So you could have the children bringing in the paper. It's recycling, it's sustainable. You could measure the paper that is brought in. How much have you brought in? So you could do measurements in mathematics. You could do proportions of how much glue to paper is needed. And then you could do artwork where they actually mold. You could make pen holders. You could make, I don't know, glasses holders for the parents. You could make a flower vase. If you varnish it afterwards, it becomes waterproof. You could let the children make what they wish to make. Once it's dried and varnished, they could paint it and decorate the colors on it and take it home as a gift for parents. So you've got this idea of a circular economy. You've got paper that's being used, being recycled, being repurposed, and then making another product without creating or chopping down trees and having to have fresh paper from scratch. Yeah. So you've got all of that comes in. And you can then bring in the idea of sustainability, the idea of materials, what materials you can recycle and what you can't recycle. Now, why does this matter? Well, Greta Thunberg last week in a Guardian article said that 3 billion people use less energy on an annual per capita basis than a standard American refrigerator uses. That's quite something. 3 billion people use less energy per capita than an average American refrigerator. That's energy. That energy has to come from somewhere, right? Why should so many people have to consider where their energy comes from and use it very carefully, like the people I knew in Nepal, when other people can have a double door fridge with, you know, unlimited ice, jam-packed to the door with food? Why should that be possible? Why is there this inequity? And those are the kind of questions that we can bring out in the classroom, still doing English language learning, but the topic is more relevant. Now, it can be about their environment. It doesn't have to be about glaciers, as Harry was reminding us. It needs to be from the context. And at the end of the day, 10 of the countries and areas in the world that are worst hit by climate change produce 0.13% of global emissions. There's something wrong there. So I hope you will agree with me in saying that Nelson Mandela was just too right when he said, we can change the world and make it a better place. It's in your hands to make a difference. So let's do it. Let's make a difference. Let's bring over that change. So I'm going to hand over now.
Thank you so much, Zarina. Thank you. Can we see you? I can't see you. You've got sort of an icon.
Sorry there.
I feel like I'm sort of breaking into this sort of environment that you just created, Zarina. That was absolutely beautiful. Thank you so much for that talk. I saw it earlier today. I saw it earlier in the week, and it just moves me every time I see it. It's such a beautiful story with so many beautiful lessons that can be learned from that, and how I'm just hoping that everyone who's I'm looking at the chat box now, that I think everyone is also moved by it, and it's just so amazing what you accomplished with that group of students in Nepal. But it's just equally as amazing, I think, that you're able to share it here today to inspire, and hopefully going back to what Matt and what Harry alluded to as well, where you create this domino effect or a sort of a cascading ripple effect, where the teachers here today will hopefully, some teachers today will take this and move with it and do something.
And I think I'd just like to point out, Will, if I may, is that it wasn't me. It was, once it got out of my hands, it was the children that took hold of it and gave it the energy and the change that was needed. And then it went out into the community. So it's not necessarily the teachers that have to be the change makers. It's just that spark.
It's the students. I mean, also that was Harry's entire message, wasn't it? Engage, empower, and act, and get them engaged, help them and empower them to be able to do it, to make that enactment, to make that change. Just wonderful. Thank you very much for putting that session together, Zarina.
My pleasure. Thank you for giving me the opportunity.